Okay, so the purpose today is to cover the reading and explicitly to get into tracking and to understand tracking a little bit better. So, what I want you to know by the end or to focus on for the reading is the definition of tracking. Um, sorry, I kind of got to cut off, but to define ability grouping and then to understand tracking and its relationship to segregation or resegregation, the impact on African American students, the impact on student achievement, how teachers define tracking or feel about it, basically. And then by the end, what's important is to know some of the alternatives or different approaches to get rid of tracking. So, in terms of defining it, and one of the things that makes it hard in the US is that we don't have a national policy. Germany, for example, has a very rigidly tracked system. Kids go to a similar elementary school, and then at a certain point, they begin to divide, and they have three different schools that kids end up going to, or three different kind of tracked levels, and that was somewhat consistent with European countries, but they had national policies, education policies that determine that. In some places, for example, students at a certain point in their career take a test, and then that test determines, basically what track they go into, and then that track. In the U.S., it's different. We don't have a national policy, but I think there are some core components to it. One of the key things is that there's a judgment made about a student's ability uh, or their capacity for learning, and then the other component would be that it has an occupational outcome. So some tracks are oriented toward college access, which would be professional level jobs. Some students end up in tracks that are related to, and this is the way it's been through most of the 20th century. Tracking began in the progressive era. We've talked about that in curriculum differentiation. So some kids going into tracks that would lead them to factory service level position, things like that. Um, so yeah, and then again, the process varies. For ability grouping, the reading defines it as what they call it as kind of a softer form of tracking that occurs within classrooms. I would say that ability grouping tends to precede tracking. So in elementary schools, you tend to get ability grouping more often. Um, and there's a lot of euphemisms that are given or different groupings, and then they use the names of birds or the Blue Jay reading groups or different things like that. But most kids tend to know. I think the thing that makes it related to tracking is that it tends to form a bit of a hierarchy um, to make judgments about the student's ability, and then to expose them to different curriculum or coursework. I think that you know with the definition of tracking too. If you think about a train, like once you get on that track, it has a predetermined outcome, and I think that if you ask certain people about tracking, what they would tell you is that it's to provide more support for students who need it, or to provide extra, um, you know, for kids to get ahead or to give them the curriculum that they need. But in reality, I think everyone knows that the gap between tracks widens over time. The effects are cumulative. If you start off in a low track in elementary school, the those the differences are going to tend to widen over time. Another feature that I think is relevant to tracking systems in the U.S. is that and I think if you had tracking in your school system, you would probably know that maybe there were some friends you had in elementary school who ended up in a different track, and then you didn't really see them through much of middle school and high school. So it tends to separate students out, and then those students don't interact or mix, over the time. So again, you might think about some of your experiences and schools you've observed and things you've seen in terms of tracking. Um, it might also be, and we'll get into this, but that your school wasn't rigidly tracked or did not have tracking, and I'll talk about that. But again, there's the beliefs are that students differ greatly. You need separation to manage the difference. Kids aren't going to change much dramatically over time in terms of their ability, and that you can easily classify students. So I think these are the beliefs that have been infused through much of the 20th century into schools. I think each of these are really problematic views. Tracking declined in the 1990s. Through the 80s, there was a body of research that built up about, it was almost like for a while, tracking was just part of the DNA system of schools, but there wasn't a way to talk about it or a real look at it. It was just part of schools that were passed on over time, and it just seemed to become like a natural component of schools. But in the 1990s, a body of literature developed. People started to criticize it and look at it. And then schools started to do away with it. So if your school was not rigidly tracked, or if you were able to move into the different classes, or if it was transparent, then that's probably because of the reforms that happened in the 1990s and early 2000s. So tracking really ended up decreasing dramatically, but then after No Child Left Behind, it had a tremendous resurgence. So I questioned whether or not I should even continue to talk about tracking in class, but then this resurgence happened. Um, and so it is still, I think, one of the most relevant issues in education today. Um, there is, of course, a major racial disparity in relation to tracking, and that's post Brown versus Board of Education. There are major disparities in access to the different tracks and inequities that occur. And I will give some examples of those. Um, Arne Duncan, who was when this piece was written, he was the Secretary of Education under President Obama, and he began to draw attention to this issue in Obama's second term. And the Department of Education has investigated a number of school districts for major disparities, and they basically ordered the schools to then take steps to begin to mitigate or undo some of these problematic aspects of these disparities. And I just thought I'd mention, like, the Department of Education they don't come in, it's not a heavy-handed thing. What they do is they point out the gaps to the school districts, and then the school districts develop plans, their own plans to begin to deal with things, to develop remedies to the problem. And so, as I mentioned, race is a major component or issue here. And one of the statistics that I wanted you to be familiar with, cited in the reading, is that African American and Latino students represent 16% of the African Americans at 16% of the population, Latinos at 21% of the overall high school population nationally. But then in terms of tracking, only make up 8% of advanced level math classes for African Americans and 12% for Latinos. So there's uh, a kind of twofold disparity that exists in terms of underrepresentation. So a major disparity that exists nationally. Um, so basically, the U.S. Department of Education. This is what I also wanted you to be aware of: is that they used the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or Title VI, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, with programs that receive federal funding. And so that's the basis upon which the Department of Education has looked into some of these disparities and asked for school districts to come up with remedies to address them. So that's basically for race and the issues and the evidence. For student achievement, basically, when they've looked into, they cite a Stanford researcher in the piece when you look at more heavily tracked districts, they have gaps in student achievement, lower student achievement in more heavily tracked um, programs. And that's true internationally as well. Countries that have, like Germany that I've mentioned, that has a more rigidly tracked system has lower student achievement. And then resources are also an issue here, that lower track classes have fewer resources, um, and things like that. To give an example sometimes of how things happen, and this isn't always the case, but like, and it's changed a bit in Muncie. Today, now Muncie, the school districts, the schools in Muncie are much more kind of racially divided, but traditionally, like Longfellow tended to be the predominantly African American school. And I just use this as an example because this happens in a lot of different areas, where you have elementary schools that are racially segregated. Some have more resources and opportunities available, but then they all filter into the same high school. So when kids end up in the same high school, then you know, then there's the tracking system that then separates them again. Um, with students whose parents have more influence um, in the higher level classes, and other students in the lower level. This was sort of a quote from the piece that you can look in a class and basically know whether it's an upper level or lower level based on its racial composition. And they give examples. I posted a video on Canvas of the Orange Maplewood School District and the case there. And the person that's interviewed in the piece we read is interviewed in that video clip that I shared with you, an African American father. And his daughter had all the prerequisites. She had the test scores, she had the grades, all the things to get in the upper level, but she was denied access because she didn't have a teacher recommendation. So he went to court over it, and that was a district where there was a major disparity. Even though the school district was relatively balanced, it was, I think, 38% or so African American, partly white. The other half, the tracked systems, the upper level classes were major disparities. And so those would then again replicate in the lower level classes. The piece points out as well the students that suffer the most in tracking are in those lower levels. As I pointed out earlier, the effects of tracking are cumulative, meaning, the disparities don't lessen over time; they increase over time. If you are in a lower track program, over the course of your high school career, that the disparities that you entered in are going to widen, not lower, not lessen. So inequality has intensified. And then again, as I mentioned, school districts need to come up with plans to deal with them. So this is the example that I gave you, the South Orange Maplewood district, that was relatively, again, balanced. You can kind of see here the racial distribution is pretty split in these two examples of Columbia High School and Orange Maplewood, with white and African American students sort of dividing up the population. But you can see that when it comes to the AP courses, major disparity with white students, the underrepresentation of African Americans. Another thing that I thought I'd point out is when there is when they do desegregate those programs, students tend to do well in them. So it does raise student achievement and student scores. This was an example, the GATE program here, and I think it's helpful to point out again, the Department of Education didn't come in and force the school district to get rid of their accelerated program. They just asked that the school come up with a plan to make a more representative balance in the population of the accelerated program. This is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, what I've mentioned. And what I wanted you to be familiar with is just Title VI, because that's what's mentioned in the piece we read. And that, again, bans discrimination from programs that receive federal funding. So when I mentioned about students, students were surveyed, and about 43% of teachers uh, basically said that tracking, I don't know that they were necessarily in favor of it, but felt that with No Child Left Behind, class sizes, and the other pressure, that tracking was needed to sort of manage those differences. Um, and I think that that's kind of a relevant, discussion, that it is hard to mitigate the problematic aspects of tracking unless you have the supports in place um, for teachers to handle those issues. Muncie, I think, is one example, has tried to do a lot of innovative um, things. I mean, they do have a segregated elementary, program for students, but they also try to do pull out supports, for students within classes and things like that to keep the classes more mixed. Um, I would also say I think that there's kind of a myth of a homogeneous classroom. Like, you're never going to get a classroom where all the kids are on the same level. You're going to have issues with meeting kids who just kind of get things at a different pace. Who operate at a slightly different pace, and so that's always, I think, an issue um, that teachers need to deal with. So one of the things I wanted to mention as well is the alternatives that are given for tracking. Now, of course, I mean, one is just to get rid of the accelerated programs or the track programs, or kind of get rid of tracking altogether. I can tell you that from what I've seen in terms of research, those that can be as equally problematic as a tracked system if it's not done thoughtfully, or with the right supports in place. So just abolishing all different levels within a program can be problematic if you don't have some sort of plan, supports, resources in place to manage it. Um, Other approaches are, monitoring the number of students that apply. Um, in terms of socioeconomic disparities, kids who are from working class families, um, I think sometimes don't have the same access to knowledge about the program. Um, so one of the things that, for example, guidance counselors will do in schools is make sure that if students test into a gifted program or a accelerated program, that they follow up with those students and the parents and explain the options and the opportunities to them. That they make sure that the student and the families know, what options are available to them. And if you don't do that, then I think you just end up with the students whose parents are motivated and whose parents have access to resources, um, you know, getting into those higher level classes. One of the alternatives that I like the most is removing the barriers to tracked programs, getting rid of, some of the testing, some of the, need for recommendations and for different things, just letting kids who want to be in those higher levels try to be successful in those levels, provide the support they need. And if they don't make it, then there's always the option of, of going into those other classes. So that tends to be the one that I think is the most potentially effective. Um, which is similar to, like, I would, just say, like, with uh, college as well. If you're motivated and you want to be in the honors program or something like that, you have those options available to you. But there aren't, like, a high level amount of barriers to doing that. So, all right, I hope this hits on, the key points.